In 2008, the entire global banking system came within days of collapse, but was not the first time, it was not even the worst time, because everything that happened in 2008 had happened before, bigger, deeper, and far more brutal, almost 80 years earlier. And the men who ran the system in 2008 had this earlier catastrophe sitting right there in the history books, and chose not to read it. This is the story of the Great Depression, the crash of 1929, and the decade of ruin that followed, a collapse so complete it only truly ended when the world went to war. And the machine that caused it is one you'll recognize instantly because you just watched it destroy the world a second time. Borrowed money. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand how far America fell, you first have to understand how high it had climbed. In the decades before the crash, the United States transformed from a young nation into the most powerful industrial force the world had ever seen, and it was built by a handful of extraordinary, ruthless men. John D. Rockefeller took control of oil and lit the world. Andrew Carnegie mastered steel and gave America its skeleton, its railroads, its bridges, its skyscrapers. And Henry Ford did something even more radical. With the moving assembly line, he took the automobile, a toy for the rich, and made it something an ordinary worker could own. These men built an economy of staggering scale and confidence, and for a time, one president tried to keep that raw power in check. Theodore Roosevelt, who broke up the great monopolies and reminded American capitalism that it could not simply devour everything in its path. Hold on to that idea, a strong hand keeping the system honest, because when that hand later let go, disaster followed. There was one more piece of machinery being assembled in these years, and it sits at the center of everything. In 1910, a small group of the most powerful bankers and politicians in America met in complete secrecy on a private island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. They told the outside world they were going duck hunting. In reality, they were designing a central bank. 3 years later, in 1913, that design became law, and the Federal Reserve was born. America now had a central authority that could control the nation's money. And in that era, money meant something very specific. The dollar was tied to gold. You could, in principle, exchange your paper dollars for real gold and gold for dollars. The money in your pocket was a claim on something solid and finite. Remember that anchor, the link between paper and gold. It will matter enormously when the panic comes. Then came the First World War. For years, Europe tore itself apart in the trenches. America stayed out until 1917, when it finally entered and tipped the balance decisively toward the Allies. The war ended, and the United States emerged not as a wounded survivor, but as the strongest, richest nation on Earth, the world's new center of gravity. Its president, Woodrow Wilson, sailed to Paris and was greeted like a savior. He laid out a vision to end all wars, his famous 14 points, and championed a new global body to keep the peace, the League of Nations. And here is the bitter irony that would echo for decades. Wilson built the League, and then his own country refused to join it. Without America, the League was weak from birth, and years later, as nations like Japan, Italy, and Germany abandoned it entirely and rearmed, that weakness would help drag the world into a second, even greater war. But that was still in the future. For now, America stood on top of the world, richer and more confident than any nation in history. And confidence is where every bubble begins. The 1920s were a party unlike anything the world had seen. Credit was cheap and easy. Factories roared, and the machine age put miracles into ordinary hands. A Ford Model T, which had once cost a small fortune, now sold for just a few $100s, within reach of the very workers who built it. For a stretch of that decade, an ordinary man on a factory wage could support a whole family, buy a car, even buy a home. Radios appeared in living rooms, electricity spread. There was a feeling in the air that prosperity would simply rise forever, and that everyone was invited. It was also, strangely, the age of Prohibition. Alcohol was banned across America. But all that ban really did was hand a fortune to the gangsters who sold it in the shadows, turning men like Al Capone into kings of a vast criminal economy. Even the country's vices were booming. And something deeper was changing in how Americans lived. This was the birth of the modern consumer. For the first time, ordinary people were told they no longer had to save up for what they wanted. They could have it now and pay for it later. Buy now, pay later installment plans spread to everything. The car, the radio, the washing machine, the furniture. A whole nation quietly learned to live on borrowed money, and, more importantly, to believe that this was normal. Even clever. It was a new world of cars and cinemas and radio, of women who had just won the right to vote, of cities swelling with people chasing the dream. Debt no longer felt like a danger. It felt like progress. But underneath the glamour, a collective decision was being made. A decision by an entire society to treat borrowed money as wealth and to assume the good times would simply never end. And the boom was far more fragile than it looked. The riches were not shared evenly. Farmers were already struggling. Wages for ordinary workers were not keeping pace with the soaring profits at the top, where a small handful captured most of the gains. So, the mountain of goods pouring out of the factories was increasingly being bought not with rising pay, but with rising debt. A country had silently agreed to mistake credit for prosperity and speculation for certainty. That agreement was the crack in the foundation, and almost no one could see it because everyone was standing on it together. Everything felt possible, and in that mood of unstoppable optimism, Americans discovered a new way to get rich, one that would eventually destroy them. They discovered the stock market, and more importantly, they discovered how to buy stocks with money they didn't have. It was called buying on margin, and it is the beating heart of this entire story. So let me explain it simply. Normally, to buy $100 of stock, you need $100. But in the 1920s, a broker would let you buy that stock by putting down as little as $10 and lending you the other 90. Think about what that does. If the stock rises just 10%, your $100 share is now worth $110. You sell, pay back the 90 you borrowed, and you've turned your $10 into 20. You've doubled your money on a 10% move. That is the intoxicating magic of leverage. And in a market that only went up, it felt like free money. So, everyone did it. Not just the wealthy, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, cab drivers. There's a famous saying from the era, when the man shining your shoes starts giving you stock tips, the top is near. The rocket ship of the age was a company called RCA, Radio Corporation of America, the hot new technology stock of its day, riding the radio boom. Its price didn't rise. It exploded, multiplying many times over as speculators piled in. And people weren't buying RCA because they'd studied it. They were buying it because it was going up, and it was going up because everyone was buying it. You've seen this exact loop before. In 2008, it was houses. In the 1920s, it was stocks. Same fever, different decade. But underneath the euphoria, something was rotting. The factories that made the 20s roar had a problem. They were producing far more than people could actually afford to buy. Cars, radios, appliances, piling up. For a while, easy credit hit it because people bought on borrowed money, but wages weren't keeping up with the mountain of goods or with the dizzying prices of the stocks. The market had floated free of reality. Share prices no longer reflected what companies were truly worth. They reflected only the belief that someone else would pay more tomorrow. A few clear-eyed observers warned that it couldn't last. They were ignored or laughed at, dismissed as pessimists who just didn't understand that this time was different. It is never different. In late October 1929, the belief cracked. On October the 24th, a day remembered as Black Thursday, prices began to fall hard, and a tremor of fear ran through Wall Street. Then, on October the 29th, Black Tuesday, the floor gave way completely. The market collapsed in a wave of panic selling, billions in value vaporizing in hours. And here is where leverage turned a fall into an apocalypse. Remember all those people who bought on margin? $10 of their own, 90 borrowed? When the stock dropped, the broker made a margin call, demanding they immediately put up more money to cover the loss, but they didn't have it. So the brokers sold their shares out from under them to get the loan back. Millions of forced sales, all at once, which drove prices down further, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling. A death spiral. The same leverage that had multiplied everyone's gains on the way up now multiplied their losses on the way down. And this time, the losses were bigger than everything they owned. The crash was only the beginning. The real horror was what came next. The brokers who had lent all that margin money were ruined. The banks that stood behind them began to fail, and when word spread that banks were collapsing, ordinary people rushed to pull out their savings all at once. The terror known as a bank run. But here's the thing about a bank. It never has everyone's money sitting in the vault. So when everyone demands their cash at the same time, even a healthy bank dies. Thousands of banks failed, and when a bank died, the life savings inside it simply vanished. Gone. Wiped out. The liquidity that had flooded the economy in the 20s evaporated completely, and the human cost is almost impossible to describe. Unemployment climbed to around 25%, 1 in 4 workers with no job at all. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Families lost their homes, their farms, everything. Despair settled over the country like a fog, and for many, the loss was more than they could bear. This was not a bad year. This was a lost decade. The Great Depression ground on through the entire 1930s and only truly lifted when the world marched into another war. Now, how did the government respond? And this is where the story speaks directly to 2008. At first, it largely didn't. The authorities, and the Federal Reserve itself, mostly stood back and let the fire burn. There were no great rescues for the failing banks, no bailouts for the ruined speculators. The weak institutions were allowed to die. Call it what it was, a brutal natural selection. The businesses and banks that had gorged on reckless debt collapsed and were swept away. It was merciless, and the human suffering was staggering. And I want to be honest, because this is a genuine debate. Many economists argue the government's failure to act made the depression far deeper and longer than it needed to be. Letting it all burn had a terrible price, paid by ordinary people who did nothing wrong. But out of that wreckage, America finally did something wise. Under President Franklin Roosevelt, the country built protections so this could never happen the same way again. It created deposit insurance, so a bank failure could never again erase your savings overnight. It created a watchdog for the markets, the SEC, and it built a wall, a law separating the safe, boring business of ordinary banking from the wild casino of Wall Street speculation. If you know the story of 2008, you know exactly what that wall is. It's the same barrier that was quietly torn down in the decades before 2008, the protection whose destruction let the next catastrophe happen. It was born right here in the ashes of 1929. So let's put the two crises side by side because the contrast is the whole point. In 1929, everyone lost. The reckless were wiped out along with the innocent. Nature took its brutal course. In 2008, the system was saved. The great institutions that caused the disaster were rescued with public money, and, as we saw, the losses were quietly spread onto everyone else through years of printed money. The reckless were protected. There was no natural selection. Which approach was right? That's one of the great unresolved arguments in economics, and honest people land on both sides. But the pattern is undeniable. In 2008, the people at the top were shielded from the consequences of their own gambling. And when you shield gamblers from consequences, you simply guarantee they'll gamble again. And here is the harshest lesson of all. One for anyone who believes the stock market is a guaranteed win if you just wait long enough. After 1929, the American market didn't recover in a year or 5 years. The Dow Jones did not climb back to its 1929 peak until 1954, roughly 25 years later. An entire generation waited to get back to even, and it can be worse. Look at Japan. Its stock market, the Nikkei, peaked in 1989 in a bubble of its own, and then collapsed. It did not recover in 10 years, or 20 or 30. It took until 2024, about 34 years, to finally reclaim that old high. Anyone who bought at the top and simply held for the long term waited most of their adult life just to break even. We have a comforting phrase for the investor who buys, watches it fall, and refuses to sell. We call him a long-term holder. Sometimes that's wisdom. Sometimes it's just a nicer name for someone who never learned when to walk away. That no institution is ever truly safe was proven again in 2008, when Lehman Brothers, a firm everyone believed was too big to fail, vanished in 48 hours. History had already taught that lesson once. Almost no one listened. So what do we actually take from 1929? Let me leave you with the lessons this catastrophe paid for in full. First, and above all, be very careful buying anything with borrowed money. Leverage is a machine that magnifies, and it magnifies your ruin just as eagerly as your riches. It built the fortunes of the 20s, and it destroyed them. There's a line often attributed to Warren Buffett that a smart person really only goes broke 3 ways: liquor, ladies, and leverage. The first 2 are optional. The third has taken down more brilliant people than all the others combined. Second, nothing is too big to fail, and no market is guaranteed to recover in your lifetime. Knowing when to sell is a skill, and the story that it always comes back eventually is a comfort that Japanese investors waited 34 years to test. And third, the deepest one. The hardest part of this game was never making money while everyone else was winning. Any fool can do that in a boom. The hardest part is surviving the crash. It's knowing how to protect yourself when the music stops, because the music always, eventually, stops. The crash of 1929 built the walls that were meant to protect us. The crash of 2008 showed us we'd torn them down and forgotten why they were ever there. History doesn't repeat itself out of malice. It repeats because each generation is certain that this time is different. The least you can do, the one advantage you can give yourself, is to remember that it never is.